My past is not a memory. It's a force at my back. It pushes and steers. I may not always like where it leads me, but like any story, the past needs resolution. What's past is prologue. That is a quote from Samus Aran, the main character of the Metroid series. Like her past, the influence of video games is the prologue to our culture today. As a future video game archivist, the following question is the force at my back. How are we telling the story of that past? Today I'll explain how the government acknowledged video games as an art and deserving of preservation, how two well-known museums took different approaches in exhibiting them, and one of the few museums is now leading the way in video game preservation. But first, what is video game preservation? Keeping the game alive, evaluating strategies for preservation of console video games defines video game preservation as, quote, the set of actions to keep content alive, accessible, and functional as authentically as possible. Although video games are over 50 years old, they're considered a relatively young form of media. However, the physical media that they're produced in the past is already failing. For example, there's only one well-known working PDP-1 computer located at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, that can run the 1962 Space War video game. To help librarians, museums, and other archivists in preserving video games, the Library of Congress added an exemption to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in 2006. To summarize the full text displayed, video games are considered obsolete and exempt to circumvention if the machine or system to work is no longer manufactured. So continuing with the PDP-1 computer example, it's been out of manufacturing since 1969. Thus, Space War is considered for preservation. In May 2011, the U.S. government, through the National Endowment for the Arts, recognized video games as an art form under media arts. This allows the NEA to fund for museums nationwide, validating their importance as cultural artifacts. 2 months later, the Supreme Court ruled that video games were categorized as art and protected under the First Amendment in Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association. The Library of Congress later improved on the copyright exemption in 2015, adding video games needing an outside server for access, where the server has been taken offline, are exempt. Some video games require a network connection to a server for it to be played. But when a developer discontinues the server, it causes the video game to be unplayable or limited to certain functions. This takes away from the authentic experience in video games preservation as defined earlier. With all these changes combined, it helped museums to exhibit video games, validating them as an art and in need of being preserved. Now, let's look at the current ways that museums have exhibited them. The Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Museum of Modern Arts in New York exhibited video games soon after the NEA recognition. Up first is the Smithsonian. To bring the museum into the 21st century, they developed and toured their own exhibit called The Art of Video Games. It was the first of its kind with the goal to, quote, document and explore a 40-year evolution of video games as an artistic medium with a focus on striking visual effects and the creative effects of new technology. The Smithsonian displayed 80 video games and 20 video game systems. Visitors were greeted on the third floor with a large projection of excerpts from most of the games featured, while chip music, like the older video game soundtracks, played over the speakers. The museum broke the history of video games down into 5 eras. One game from each era was playable by the public through emulation, as the original hardware setup would have been too complicated to transport for tour. It wasn't only the games and systems on display, but other materials such as illustrations mounted on panels. They told the story behind the game design and helped show designers' intent. Together, the exhibit was focused on that video games are qualified as an art form. Now, let's compare it to the Museum of Modern Art exhibit, Applied Design. The following year, the Museum of Modern Art included 14 video games in their exhibit, with 9 of them playable for the public. Visitors could put on headphones and interact with the screens mounted on the gallery's white or dark gray walls using joysticks or controllers that rest on a shelf below. There were no other visuals to the games displayed. No artwork, no video game system. It put the design of the video game front and center. But the exhibit wasn't focused on video games alone. It included several other innovative designed items such as the basic home prototype, a wind-powered deminer, 3D printed furniture, and more. However, in April 2016, a new museum opened and took game preservation to a whole new level, the National Videogame Museum. It was first a large collection from several individuals who toured it at different conventions. It was a traveling museum until it got a permanent home with the help of Kickstarter. Visitors are greeted by a giant, playable Pong machine, but there are plenty of other games that are available. The National Video Game Museum showcased artwork, props, developer items, an arcade, and more. It is one of the few museums that focuses solely on video games. The museum hopes to eventually add a theater room, an archive center, and a game library where visitors will be able to play over 12,000 video game titles. Thanks to the government acknowledgement that video games are an art form, it paved the way for nationally known museums to inspire the public with their first video game exhibits, which led to one of the few museums focused on video game preservation. As more museums accept video games and add them as possibility for exhibits, they'll have to continue to find ways to solve the problem of public access versus preservation, which is why I've returned to college to bring new options for them at the fan standard. But for now, that's another chapter of the story not yet written.